All the while she was assuming he was right behind her. She managed to reach safety and turned and looked, and he wasn't behind her. She looked towards the river, even down the river, and saw him struggling against the currents. The only thing she could figure out that he had spent all of his energy saving her, getting her out of the water. Well, she knew the exit for the Cortland to the Cortland town was right near there, and so she hiked up her skirts and took off running. And it was a Sunday, and there was a bunch of men outside of town playing a game of baseball, which was fairly new sport. It wasn't as popular as it is today, but at least there was a bunch of men there that she went running up to and explained what their problem was, that her boyfriend was in the water and possibly drowning, and one of the men took charge and he yelled at all the men that had boats in town, and they took off running to get their boats, and the rest of the men he took off for the river. Agnes hiked up her skirts again and kept up with them as best she could. They got down to the river and there was nothing they could do. Trees and brush on both sides. You couldn't really follow the river down from the shoreline. But by then the boats showed up and they started loading up the boats with men, and they started downriver. It took a couple hours, but they finally found him, or at least his body. He was tangled in some brush alongside of one side of the river, and they got his body out, took him back. Agnes was devastated. She went to the funeral. The funeral was officiated by the boy's father, which had to be tough for him. And after the funeral, she went back to Nicollet, to her parents' home. My great-grandfather and grandmother, Otto and Anna were the names. And she went up to her bedroom. She'd come down to eat, but that was it. Otherwise, she stayed in her room. I guess Anna said she cried a lot, she prayed a lot. She was confused. She had this mystery that she couldn't figure out why she was saved. She didn't know how to swim, yet she was saved. Her boyfriend was a big, strong, athletic guy, and he died. She was left with this to think, to ponder, and to mourn. She spent about a year mourning. Everybody tried to get her to come out. Her friends tried to get her to come out and talk about things and so forth. She just wanted to stay there with her thoughts, trying to figure out what went wrong. Finally, after a year, she came downstairs and told her father and mother, Otto and Anna, that she'd made a decision. And they said, "Well, we're glad to hear that. What's your decision?" She said, "I've had the love of my life. I don't want to go through this again. My decision is I can't figure out why I was saved. So I want to do something to help mankind." And what she had done while she was in mourning was ridden around trying to find places that had a nursing program. Once again, I got to remind you that this is about 1905 or 6. Mayo Clinic was just starting out. They didn't have a nursing program, and every college has one now. But then they didn't. But she found one in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and it was sponsored by a church. And she had signed up to go to this nursing school and to serve mankind that way. We mentioned postcards earlier, and she sent lots of postcards back home to my grandparents, and everybody saved them, penny postcards. And Agnes was very devoted to her duties as a nurse. She studied real hard. She promoted the school through postcards. She sent them to friends and other gals that were cousins of hers, and wound up getting a whole bunch of Nicollet girls in the nursing program. Now, there were certain school studies, but most of their training was on the job. They have today what they call a hospice program. When somebody is passing away, they usually know about it beforehand. And in the class, her class, they would assign them to go and stay with a person that was on their deathbed. As I said, she was in this program, which included a lot of hospice care and care for people that were passing away. I guess that's good training for a nurse. When she graduated from the system, she came back to Nicollet, said hello to her parents, and almost the next day went to New Ulm. And there were 2 hospitals in New Ulm in those days. The one she applied to and got a job at was called the Union Hospital. She worked there her whole life, very devoted. Her home was still Nicollet. Her parents were there, and she'd go home when she could. But mostly she stayed at the hospital. I guess she worked long hours. Anybody was tired or one of the other nurses went home sick, she was the first one to volunteer to take their hours for them. And she'd catch some sleep in one of the empty hospital beds. She did go home to Nicollet, usually weekends, and usually on Sunday, and go to church with my grandfather, Henry. And then back to New Ulm again, to the hospital to work. A lot of the travel was done by train at first and buses later. Her whole life, she never drove a car. Never had a driver's license. All she did was go back and forth to New Ulm to work. Eventually, she became the head nurse of the entire hospital. And she was in that position her whole life. I was born there. I don't remember her being there, but she was. 2 of my sons were born there, and I know she was there. She always was there. Anybody that went to that hospital in the family, she would be there. She started having vision problems and other problems related to age. She was well past her retirement age. but she had requested that she could stay working as long as possible. And the board knew she always did a good job and so forth. And so they let her stay as long as she could. But her vision power finally gave out, and that was the end of her days at the hospital. As soon as she gave up that part of her life, and I don't remember how old she was, I think she was 80 years old and still working there, she went home and passed away. The sad part of it is she never had a family. She had people like me. I'm her great nephew. And some of us were talking that it's a sad thing. There are people all over the world that live a life and live a full life, a meaningful life like she did. But there's nobody to remember it. That's why I'm telling the story today. Rest in peace, Agnes.